The sound was not a scream, but the wet, sickening snap of a tibia shattering under the weight of a misstep, distinct and horrifying even over the banshee howl of the Montana wind. It was the kind of noise that signaled an ending. Elias Thorne felt the vibration of it travel up through the worn leather of his saddle, vibrating through his thighs and settling like a stone in his gut before the roan mare even hit the ground. She went down hard, thrashing in the powder, her terrified whinnies instantly swallowed by the white void of the blizzard. Elias was thrown clear, rolling instinctively, his face scraping against the icy crust of the snowpack until he slammed into the trunk of a dead pine. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the grey, churning sky, listening to the hoarse scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, and it woke the ghosts he had spent 10 years trying to drink into silence. Before we follow this journey, please subscribe and stay until the very end. Comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. Elias pushed himself up, his joints protesting with the audible creak of rusted hinges. He was a mountain of a man, though looking at him now, you'd see more beast than human. His beard was a tangled thicket of iron grey and black, matted with ice, hiding a face that had forgotten how to smile a decade ago. He wore a buffalo hide coat that smelled of wood smoke and old blood, and his eyes, buried deep beneath the brim of a battered Stetson, were the color of flint, hard, sparkless, and cold. He limped toward the mare. She was his only companion, the only living thing that didn't look at him with pity or fear, and now, seeing the angle of her leg, he knew his solitude was about to become absolute. He didn't weep. Elias Thorne had run out of tears the day he lowered a pine box no bigger than a suitcase into the frozen earth next to a larger one. He simply drew the heavy Bowie knife from his belt. He whispered something into the mare's ear, a lie about green pastures, and ended her pain with the practiced, merciful efficiency of a man who had grown too comfortable with death. Now he was alone. Truly alone. The ranch, the double T that had once been the envy of the territory, was 5 miles south. In this weather, with the temperature dropping fast enough to freeze the breath in your lungs, 5 miles might as well have been 500. Elias wiped the blade on his chaps, leaving a dark streak that froze instantly, and began to walk. The wind was a physical weight, a bully shoving him backward, stinging his exposed skin with thousands of invisible needles. Every step was a battle. He kept his head down, watching his boots disappear into the drifts, his mind drifting dangerously. It was easy to let go out here. The cold was seductive. It whispered to him in Clara's voice, "Just sit down, Elias. It's warm in the snow. Just rest." He could see her sometimes, in the swirling white dust devils, the curve of her cheek, the way she held her shawl. "Not today," he grunted, the words torn away by the gale. "Not today, Clara." He wasn't walking toward hope. He was walking out of spite. He trudged toward the property line, toward the old North Line shack, a dilapidated structure he hadn't visited in years, mostly because it sat on the ridge overlooking the valley where he had proposed to her. He needed shelter before he could make the push for the main house. It took him 2 hours to reach the ridge. His extremities were numb, his eyebrows thick with frost. The silhouette of the shack appeared like a smudge of charcoal against the white canvas. He staggered toward it, his lungs burning with the effort of inhaling the razor-sharp air. That's when he saw it. A faint orange glow leaking from the cracks in the rough-hewn timber. Elias stopped. The wind tore at his coat, but he stood still, as a statue. Fire meant people. People meant trouble. In the last 3 years, the only men who rode this far north were cattle thieves or the hired guns of Josiah Sterling, the land baron who had been buying up the valley with blood money, circling Elias's land like a buzzard waiting for the final breath. Elias's hand moved to the Colt Navy revolver, frozen to his hip. He didn't want company. He wanted the silence of his grief. He approached the shack from the blind side, moving with a predator's grace despite the exhaustion dragging at his bones. He reached the door, the wood swollen and warped, and listened. No voices. Just the low, mournful whistle of the wind through the chinking. He drew the hammer back. Click! Elias kicked the door open, the rusted hinges shrieking. He leveled the gun into the gloom, his silhouette filling the frame, the snow swirling around him like a cape. "You are trespassing," he roared, his voice hoarse and terrible, the voice of a man who owned nothing but dust and bad memories. The scene inside stopped him cold. It wasn't Sterling's men. It wasn't Rustler's. Huddled in the corner, pressed against the rotting wood, as if trying to merge with it, was a woman. She was wrapped in rags that might have once been a fine dress, now shredded and stiff with grime. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut, her lips blue with hypothermia. But it was her eyes, wide, feral, terrified, that held him. And in her arms, shielded by the desperate curve of her body, was a child. A boy, no older than 7, his face buried in her chest, shaking so violently it looked like a seizure. They froze, staring at the giant in the doorway with the gun. Elias looked like a demon rising from the ice, blood on his chaps, knife at his belt, wild-eyed and dusted with snow. The woman didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply tightened her grip on the boy and glared at Elias with the defiance of a cornered wolf. In her hand, she held a piece of firewood, raised like a club. It was pathetic. It was brave. Elias lowered the gun, but he didn't holster it. "I said you're trespassing," he growled, though the venom had leaked out of his tone, replaced by a confusion that irritated him. "This is my land. We have nowhere," the woman rasped. Her voice was brittle, like dry leaves. "The storm." Elias looked at the fire. It was dying. They were burning loose shingles from the roof. It wasn't enough. The cold was already creeping in through the floorboards. He looked at the boy. The child turned his head, just an inch, and Elias saw it, the bruising around the eye, the hollow, starving look. It was the same look the calves got before the wolves tore them apart, and for a split second, the ghost of his own son, who would have been that age, flashed in his mind. The pain hit him harder than the wind. "Get up," Elias commanded. The woman flinched. "Please, we won't take anything. We just need—" "I said get up," Elias barked, stepping into the room and slamming the door behind him to cut the draft. The sudden noise made the boy whimper, a high, thin sound that grated on Elias's nerves. "This shack is a coffin. Roof's rotted through on the east side. Wind shifts tonight. You'll both be frozen stiff by morning." The woman stared at him, trying to calculate the threat. "Where?" "My house. Main ranch, 5 miles south." "Why would you help us?" she asked, her eyes darting to the gun in his hand. Elias holstered the weapon, the movement slow and deliberate. He looked at the dying fire, then back at the woman. He didn't know why. He wanted to leave them. He wanted to kick them out and curl up in the corner and sleep until the world went away. But he looked at the boy's boots, tattered leather, toes practically exposed. "Because I ain't digging 2 holes in this frost," Elias muttered. "Ground's too hard." He stripped off his buffalo coat. The cold hit him instantly, biting through his flannel shirt, but he tossed the heavy, reeking fur onto the woman. "Put it on the boy. Wrap him tight. If he stops shivering, you tell me. Stop shivering means he's dying, you understand?" She nodded, stunned, her fingers trembling as she pulled the massive coat over the child. The boy disappeared inside it, looking like a small animal swallowed whole. "We walk," Elias said, turning back to the door. "If you fall, I leave you. If you stop, I leave you. You keep my pace or you die out here, clear?" "Clear," she whispered. Elias opened the door, and the storm punched them in the face. He stepped out, not looking back to see if they were following. He knew they were. Desperation had a sound, and he could hear their stumbling footsteps in the snow behind him. The journey back was a descent into hell. The wind had picked up, screaming across the plains, driving ice crystals into their skin. Elias walked with his head down, ploughing a path through the drifts. His leg, the one with the bad knee from the war, screamed with every step. He focused on the pain. He used it. Left foot. Right foot. Breathe. Behind him, he could hear the woman. Struggling, the snow was up to her thighs in places. He could hear her gasping, the sound wet and ragged. He didn't stop. He couldn't. If they stopped, the lethargy would set in. An hour in, the sound of footsteps ceased. Elias stopped. He stood there for a moment, the wind buffeting his back. He cursed, a vile string of words directed at God, at the snow, at the woman for being weak. He turned around. She was 10 yards, back, face down in the snow. The bundle of the buffalo coat was next to her, the boy trying to pull her up, his small hands useless against her dead weight. Elias stomped back, looming over them. "I told you," he shouted over the wind. "I told you I'd leave you." The woman looked up. Her skin was waxy, pale as milk. Her eyes were unfocused. Take him," she slurred. "Just him." Elias looked at the boy. The child wasn't crying. He was staring at Elias with an intensity that was terrifying. He stood between Elias and his mother, arms spread wide in the oversized coat, protecting her. A barrier of nothing but grit. Elias felt something crack in his chest. Not a bone, this time, but the iron casing around his heart. He growled, a sound of pure frustration. He bent down, scooping the woman up. She was light, terrifyingly light, nothing but bird bones and starvation. He threw her over his left shoulder like a sack of feed. "Grab my belt," he ordered the boy. "Do not let go. If you let go, you're gone." The boy grabbed the back of Elias's belt with both hands, burying his face in Elias's flank to escape the wind. Elias moved. The weight was crushing now. Every step was a sheer act of will. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. He was navigating by memory and the faint, familiar shapes of the land he had neglected. He hallucinated again. He saw the barn. He saw the lights on. He saw Clara standing on the porch, waving him in. "Come home, Elias. Dinner's cold." "It's a lie," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "It's just the dark." He marched until his lungs tasted of blood. He marched until he didn't know who he was. Only that he carried a burden he didn't want, but couldn't drop. And then, looming out of the white, the jagged shape of the main house appeared. It was dark, silent, and imposing. The double T, his prison, his sanctuary. He stumbled up the porch steps, the wood slick with ice, and kicked the front door. It was locked. He had locked it against the world. He fumbled for the key with fingers. That felt like wooden blocks, dropping it twice in the snow, cursing, scrabbling until he found it. He jammed it in, turned it, and shoved the heavy oak door open. They spilled inside. The air in the house was stale and freezing, colder than the outside in a way, because it held the chill of abandonment. Elias dropped the woman onto the dusty bear rug in the hallway. He slammed the door, shutting out the roar of the storm, leaving them in a silence so sudden it made his ears ring. He stood there, swaying, his breath pluming in the dark hallway. The boy was still clutching his belt. "Let go," Elias rasped. The boy let go. Elias leaned against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. His legs were done. He looked across the dark hallway at the two strangers he had just dragged into. His life. The woman wasn't moving. The boy was watching him, shivering so hard his teeth clicked like dice in a cup. "You're trespassing," Elias whispered into the dark, his voice breaking. "You're trespassing." Then, for the first time in years, Elias Thorne blacked out, not from the drink, but from the sheer crushing weight of being a human being again. Gemini said Elias woke to the smell of dust and the biting metallic taste of his own blood. For a moment, in that confused grey space between unconsciousness and waking, he didn't know where he was. The floorboards beneath his cheek were rough-hewn oak, freezing against his skin. The air was still, heavy and silent, a stark contrast to the banshee scream of the blizzard that was still tearing at the walls outside, rattling the window panes, in their frames like restless spirits trying to get in. He groaned, the sound scraping his throat, and pushed himself up. His left leg, the bad one, seized with a cramp so violent it nearly sent him back down, but he gritted his teeth and forced the muscle to submit. He was in the hallway of the Double T, his house, his tomb. Memory returned like a physical blow. The ridge, the shack, the woman, the boy. He turned his head slowly, his neck stiff as petrified wood. They were still there. The woman was slumped against the wainscoting where he had dropped her, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and ragged. The boy was awake. He was still wrapped in Elias's massive buffalo coat, a small dark mound of fur in the gloom, but two eyes, wide and terrified, were fixed on Elias. They glinted in the shadows, reflecting the faint grey light, filtering through the fanlight above the door. The child hadn't moved an inch. He was guarding her. A mouse guarding a fallen bird against a wolf. Elias rubbed his face, his hand rasping against the frozen stubble of his beard. "Quit looking at me like I'm going to eat you," he croaked. His voice sounded rusty, unused. The boy didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just watched, his small hand creeping out from the coat to clutch a fold of the woman's tattered dress. Elias scowled and used the wall to lever himself upright. The house was freezing, a deep, permeating cold that seeped into the furniture, the curtains, the very bones of the structure. It had been 3 days since he'd bothered to light a fire in the main hearth. He usually stayed in the bunkhouse or the barn. The main house was too full of ghosts. But now, with the temperature dropping to 20 below and 2 half-dead strangers, on his floor, he had no choice. "Don't move," Elias commanded the boy, though he doubted the child could if he wanted to. "You move, you freeze. Simple as that." He limped into the great room. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that took up half the far wall. The furniture was draped in white sheets, looking like phantom shapes in the dim light. Dust motes danced in the stagnant air. Elias ignored the memories that tried to snag his attention. The piano in the corner that hadn't been played in 6 years, the empty rocking chair by the window. He went straight to the woodbox. It was empty. Of course it was. He cursed, a low, savage sound, and went to the back door. He had to kick the snowdrift away just to get it open, letting in a blast of wind that cut through his flannel shirt like a knife. He grabbed an armful of split cordwood from the porch stack, the bark rough and icy against his forearms, and kicked the door shut again. Kneeling before the hearth, Elias worked with mechanical precision. His hands were numb, his fingers thick and clumsy, fumbling with the tinder. He shaved slivers of pine with his knife, his breath pluming in front of him. Strike, spark, nothing. Strike, spark. A tiny curl of smoke. He nursed it, blowing gently, feeding it dry moss, then kindling, then the smaller logs. The fire caught with a whoosh, the dry wood cracking and popping as the flames licked upward, hungry for oxygen. The orange light spilled out into the room, chasing back the shadows, revealing the neglect of the last decade, the cobwebs in the corners, the layer of grit on the mantel. Elias held his hands to the fire, watching the steam rise from his damp sleeves. The pain of the blood returning to his fingertips was excruciating, 1,000 needles pricking him at once. He welcomed it. Pain meant he was alive. Pain meant he wasn't numb anymore. He turned back to the hallway. The woman was stirring. "Get in here," Elias called out. "Floor's harder than granite out there." The woman's eyes fluttered open. She looked around wildly, panic seizing her features until her gaze landed on the boy. She relaxed instantly, exhaling a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. The boy was there instantly, trying to shoulder her weight, his small face contorted with effort. Elias watched them for a second, annoyed by their weakness, annoyed by the tug of sympathy in his gut. He marched over, brushed the boy aside, gently, though he wouldn't admit it, and scooped the woman up again. She felt fragile, like a bundle of dry sticks. He carried her into the great room and deposited her on the rug in front of the fire. "Stay," he barked. He pointed a finger at the boy. "You too, get out of that coat. It's wet." Drag it near the fire, but not in it. I ain't losing my best coat to stupidity." The boy obeyed, shucking the heavy fur and dragging it toward the hearth. Underneath, he was wearing oversized trousers held up by a piece of rope and a shirt that was more holes than fabric. He was shivering violently now that the adrenaline was fading. Elias turned away. He couldn't look at the boy. The shivering, it reminded him of the fever that had taken Samuel. "Stop it," he told himself. "Do the work." He went to the kitchen. It was even colder in here. The water in the wash basin was a solid block of ice. Elias grabbed a heavy cast-iron pot and took it to the pump at the sink. He had to prime it, working the handle up and down, the metal screeching, in the silence until a trickle of brown water spat out, followed by a clear stream. He filled the pot and carried it back to the great room, setting it on the hook over the fire. "Water needs to boil," Elias muttered, staring into the flames. "Don't drink it till I say. You drink cold water now, your gut will cramp and you'll die." The woman was sitting up now, her hands extended toward the heat, her eyes fixed on Elias. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe late 20s. Beneath the grime and the exhaustion, there was a sharpness to her features, a kind of fierce intelligence that the fear couldn't quite mask. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was stronger now, though still raspy. "Name's Thorne," Elias said, not looking at her. He was busy checking the load in his revolver, spinning the cylinder. It was a nervous habit. "Elias Thorne, and you're sitting on my rug." "I'm Sarah," she said. She gestured to the boy. "This is Toby." Elias didn't acknowledge the names. Names made them real. Names made them guests. He didn't want guests. He wanted them gone as soon as the storm broke. "Don't care. Eat, get warm, get out. That's the deal." He went back to the kitchen to find food. His larder was pathetic. A sack of dried beans, some salted pork that was hard as a rock, a tin of coffee that had probably lost its flavor 3 years ago, and a jar of peaches. He grabbed the peaches and the pork. He cut chunks of the meat with his knife, tossing them into the boiling water to make a thin, salty broth. When he returned, the boy, Toby, was staring at something. Elias followed his gaze. The boy was looking at the mantel, specifically at a small carved wooden horse that sat next to the dusty clock. It was crude, whittled from pine, with one leg slightly shorter than the others. Elias felt his chest tighten. He moved across the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and snatched the horse from the mantel. The boy flinched, throwing his hands up to cover his face, curling into a ball. The reaction was instantaneous and practiced. It wasn't the flinch of a child who feared a scolding. It was the flinch of a child who expected a blow. Elias froze. The wooden horse dug into his palm. He looked at the boy, cowering on the rug, and then at the woman. Sarah had thrown herself forward, putting her body between Elias and the child, her eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and fury. "Don't you touch him," she hissed. "Don't you dare!" Elias stood there, the giant with the gun and the toy feeling like a monster. He hadn't meant to scare the boy. He just didn't want anyone touching Samuel's things. "I wasn't gonna hit him," Elias said, his voice low. "I ain't him, whoever him is." Sarah didn't relax. She stayed crouched, a lioness protecting her cub. "You moved fast. Men who move fast usually strike." Elias looked at the wooden horse. He remembered carving it by the creek, Samuel watching him with wide, impatient eyes. "Is it done yet, Pa? Is it a Mustang?" He remembered the feel of the sun on his back, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He slowly placed the horse back on the mantel. "It ain't a toy," Elias said gruffly. "It's just wood. Old wood." He went back to the fire and stirred the pot. The smell of the boiling pork filled the room, a savory, rich scent that made his own stomach rumble. He saw the boy's nose twitch. Hunger was a powerful motivator. It could override fear. Elias ladled the broth into 2 tin mugs. He didn't have bowls handy, and he wasn't going to search for them. He handed the first mug to Sarah. She took it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was rough, calloused, a worker's hands. He held the second mug out to the boy. Toby peeked, out from behind his mother. He looked at the mug, then at Elias's face. He didn't move. "Take it," Elias said, softening his tone just a fraction. "It's hot. Blow on it." Toby hesitated, then slowly reached out. He took the mug with both hands, cradling the warmth. He took a sip and let out a small involuntary hum of pleasure. Elias turned away, grabbing the jar of peaches. He struggled with the lid for a moment before popping the seal. He used his knife to spear a peach slice and held it out. "Sugar," he said. "Good for the shock." They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind buffeting the house. The warmth was slowly reclaiming the room. The ice on the windows was beginning to weep, trails of water running down the glass like tears. As they ate, Elias sat in his armchair, the leather cracked and worn, and watched them. He watched the way Sarah broke the peach slice into tiny pieces for Toby. He watched the way she constantly checked the door, her eyes darting to the shadows. She was running from something bad enough to drive a woman into a blizzard with a child. And then it happened. Sarah shifted, trying to get comfortable on the rug, and her movement knocked over a small stack of books on the side table. They tumbled to the floor with a clatter. Flash. Suddenly, Elias wasn't in the cold, dark room. He was in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the gingham curtains. Clara was there. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a dusting of flour on her cheek. She had just dropped a pan. "Butterfingers," she laughed. "Elias, come help me, you old grump." The smell of baking bread was overwhelming. He could feel the warmth of her skin as he reached for her. He could feel the love radiating off her like heat from a stove. Then the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and the memory shattered. Elias gasped, gripping the arms of the chair so hard the leather creaked. He was back in the grey, back in the cold. Clara was gone. The kitchen was dark. The flour was dust. He looked up. Sarah was staring at him, concern etched on her face. She had frozen when the books fell, waiting for an explosion. But seeing his face, seeing the naked, raw grief that must have flashed across his eyes, she seemed to understand. "You have ghosts too," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Elias stood up abruptly. The chair groaned. "Sleep," he commanded. "Storm's getting worse. Won't be able to leave tomorrow anyway." "Where will you sleep?" Sarah asked. "I don't," Elias lied. He walked over to the gun rack and pulled down a Winchester 1873. He checked the action, the metallic clack-clack loud in the room. He grabbed a box of cartridges and sat back down in the armchair, positioning it so he faced the front door, with the fire on his right and the sleeping strangers on his left. He watched them as they settled down. Sarah curled her body around Toby, creating a human shield even in her sleep. The boy buried his face in her neck. Within minutes, their breathing leveled out. They were exhausted, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Elias stayed awake. He listened to the house settle. He listened to the wind try to tear the roof off. He watched the firelight dance on the face of the woman who wasn't Clara, and the boy who wasn't Samuel. He felt a strange, unfamiliar weight in his chest. It wasn't grief, it was responsibility. He looked at the door. If anyone came for them, whoever had put that fear in the boy's eyes, whoever had driven them into the snow, they would have to come through him. And for the first time in 10 years, Elias Thorne felt a flicker of the man he used to be. A man who held the line. He rested the rifle across his lap, his thumb tracing the hammer. "You are trespassing," he whispered to the shadows. But this time, he wasn't talking to the woman and the child. He was talking to the darkness itself. The blizzard broke on the 4th day, leaving the valley buried under 3 feet of silence. The world outside the Double T was a blinding, undulating ocean of white. the fence posts merely jagged teeth protruding from the drifts. But inside, the air had changed. The stale, tomb-like chill that had permeated the house for a decade was slowly being pushed back, not just by the roaring hearth, but by the friction of living. Trust didn't come all at once. It came in inches, like the slow retreat of a shadow at dawn. For the first week, Elias didn't speak to them much. He moved around them like a heavy piece of furniture, solid, unavoidable, and potentially dangerous. He spent his days repairing the wind damage to the barn roof, his hammer ringing out in the crisp air, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to reassure the house itself. Sarah didn't sit idle. She was a force of nature in her own right. Without asking, she took to the kitchen. She scrubbed the grime of 10 years from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw and the wood gleamed like honey. She found a sack of old flour and managed to bake biscuits that didn't taste like sawdust. The first time the smell of fresh bread hit Elias as he walked through the back door, he stopped dead in his tracks. It was a scent that belonged to another life. He looked at Sarah, who was wiping her hands on a rag, her face smeared with soot, but her eyes defiant. She was waiting for him to yell, to tell her to stop wasting his supplies. Instead, Elias just took a biscuit, ate it in 2 bites, and grunted. "Needs salt." It was the most he'd said to her in 2 days. It was a truce. But it was the boy, Toby, who changed the texture of the air. He was a ghost in the house, moving silently from room to room, his eyes always wide, always watching. He never spoke. Not a word. Sarah said the men who had held them, she never named them, just called them the riders, had beaten the voice out of him. Elias didn't push. He knew that kind of silence. It was the silence of a soul that had seen too much and decided the world wasn't worth talking to anymore. The shift happened in the barn. 2 weeks in, the snow had melted enough to turn the yard into a slurry of mud and ice. Elias was in the smithy attached to the main barn, working the forge. He was shaping a new hinge for the corral gate, the iron glowing cherry red in the coals. The heat was intense, a dry, searing wave that felt good against his aching joints. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of the hammer on the anvil was a song he knew by heart. He felt eyes on him. He turned. Toby was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sparks fly. The boy was mesmerized. Fire was dangerous, but here, under Elias's hand, it was controlled. It was useful. Elias turned back to the anvil. "Don't stand in the draft," he growled, not looking up. "Come inside, or stay out." Toby took a hesitant step inside, then another. He crept closer until the heat of the forge flushed his pale cheeks. He watched Elias plunge the hot iron into the water trough, the steam hissing violently, exploding upward in a white cloud. Toby didn't flinch. He leaned in. Elias pulled the cooled metal out. He looked at the boy. Then, on an impulse, he didn't. Understand, he handed Toby the tongs. Heavy, Elias warned. Toby took them. His small arm strained, but he held the iron up, inspecting the curve Elias had hammered into it. He looked at Elias, his eyes shining with a question. "It's a hinge," Elias said, his voice dropping to a rumble. "Holds the door. Keeps the bad out, keeps the good in. Strongest part of the house if you make it right." Toby looked at the iron, then at the massive, scarred hand of the blacksmith. He reached out, his small, trembling fingers brushing the soot-stained leather of Elias's apron. He didn't pull away. "You like horses?" Elias asked abruptly. Toby nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. "Come on." Elias led him to the back stall. There was only one horse left now, an old gelding named Barnaby that Elias had kept simply because the horse was too stubborn to die. Barnaby was massive, a mountain of roan muscle, but his eyes were gentle. "Flat hand," Elias instructed, holding his own palm out to demonstrate. "Don't curl your fingers, or he'll think it's a carrot and nip you." Toby mimicked him, his hand shaking. He reached up, Barnaby lowered his massive head, sniffing the boy's hair, his warm breath huffing out in a cloud. Toby froze, terrified, but then the velvet softness of the horse's nose touched his palm. A smile, small, fragile, and utterly heartbreaking, cracked the boy's face. It was the first time Elias had seen him look like a child instead of a refugee. Elias felt a lump form in his throat, hard as a coal. He placed his hand on Toby's shoulder. "He likes you. Reckon he knows you're quiet. Horses like quiet men." For a moment, in the dim light of the barn, with the smell of hay and hot iron around them, they weren't a broken man and a shattered boy. They were just two people finding a way to breathe. The peace lasted exactly 3 more days. It ended on Key, a Tuesday, under a sky the color of a bruised plum. Elias was chopping wood when he saw the rider. It wasn't a casual approach. The horseman sat on the ridgeline for a long time, just a silhouette against the clouds, watching the house. Then he began to descend the switchback trail. Elias didn't run. He walked calmly to the porch, leaned his axe against the railing, and picked up the Winchester he now kept loaded by the door. Sarah came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the rider. Her face went ashen, all the color draining away instantly. She grabbed the doorframe, her knuckles white. "Is it him?" she whispered. "No," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "It's a hired hand, but he rides for him." The rider pulled up 20 yards from the porch. He was a slick-looking man in a long duster, a bowler hat, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't dismount. That was an insult. "Morning," the man called out. His voice was oily. "You Thorne?" "I am," Elias said. "And you're on my land." "Just passing through, neighbor. Mr. Sterling sends his regards." The name hung in the air like smoke. Josiah Sterling, the man who owned the town, the valley, and the law. "I don't know him," Elias said. "He knows you." The rider smirked. He looked past Elias, his gaze landing on Sarah. He looked her up and down with a proprietary sneer that made Elias's finger tighten on the trigger guard. "And he knows you've found some lost livestock, a woman, a boy, runaways from the Key. Copper camp south of here, indentured servants, legally speaking, debt to pay." "They ain't livestock," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "Mr. Sterling sees it different. He paid for their passage. They belong to the company." The rider leaned forward on his saddle horn. "He wants them back, Thorne. He's a reasonable man. He's willing to pay a reward. $50 for the pair. That's a lot of money for a man living in a ruin." "Get off my land," Elias said. The rider's smile vanished. "You're making a mistake. Sterling doesn't ask twice. He takes. He'll burn this shack down around your ears with you in it." I said, "Get off my land." Elias raised the rifle, leveling it at the man's chest. "Next time you come, bring a coffin." The rider spat on the ground. "Have it your way, old man. We'll be back, and we won't be talking." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, the mud flying from the hooves. Elias watched him go until he disappeared over the ridge. He lowered the rifle and turned to Sarah. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. She looked ready to bolt. She was already mentally packing, already running. "We have to go," she gasped, stumbling toward the steps. "We have to leave now. I can't let them take Toby back there. You don't know what he does. You don't know—" "Sarah," Elias said, "no, you don't understand. He'll kill you. He'll kill us all. We have to run." She was hysterical now, grabbing Elias's arm, trying to pull him or maybe push him away to save him. Elias dropped the rifle. He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. He forced her to look at him. "Sarah!" "Look at me!" She stopped, struggling, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with panic. "I ain't running," Elias said. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. "I ran from the world for 10 years. I hid in this bottle, and I hid in this house, and I let the ghosts eat me alive. But I ain't running from this. He's too powerful." She sobbed. "He's a man," Elias said. "Just a man. And he's trespassing." He looked over her shoulder. Toby was standing in the doorway. He was holding the wooden horse Elias had carved for Samuel. He looked small, fragile, and utterly dependent on the decision Elias was making in this very second. Elias looked back at Sarah. He saw the bruises that were fading, the strength returning to her frame, the life she was trying to build out of the ashes. And he felt a rage ignite in his gut, a fire hotter than the forge, hotter than the whiskey burn. It was the rage of a father who had failed once and refused to fail again. "I won't let them take you," Elias promised. The words felt like a vow carved in stone. "I swear on my wife's grave, Sarah, I won't let them take you, not while I draw breath." Sarah looked at him, searching for the lie. She didn't find one. She slumped against him, sobbing into his chest, and for the first time in a decade, Elias, Thorne held a woman not to remember the past, but to secure the future. He looked out at the horizon where the rider had vanished. The sky was darkening. "Go inside," he said gently, releasing her. "Lock the doors." "What are you going to do?" she asked, wiping her eyes. Elias picked up his rifle. He looked at the barn, then at the house. He walked to the old steamer trunk, on the porch, the one he hadn't opened since the war. He kicked the latch open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy, long-range Sharps buffalo rifle and a bandolier of ammunition. "I'm going to get ready," Elias said, the cold returning to his eyes. But this time, it was a weapon. "If they want a war, I'll give 'em one they can write about on my tombstone." The waiting was worse than the dying. Elias knew that from the war. Dying was quick, usually, a flash of light, a punch to the gut, and then the dark. But waiting was a slow rot. It was the sound of the wind peeling a loose shingle off the roof, mimicking the sound of a bootstep. It was the way the light shifted across the floorboards, measuring out the remaining minutes of peace in agonizing inches. Elias sat in the rocking chair by the window, the heavy Sharps rifle resting across his knees like a rigid iron child. He hadn't slept in 20 hours. His eyes felt filled with sand, gritty and raw, but his hands were steady. He had barricaded the doors with the heavy oak furniture, the china cabinet Clara had loved, the table where they'd eaten their wedding supper. He had turned his home into a bunker. "Drink." Sarah's voice was a whisper. She appeared at his elbow, holding a tin cup of coffee. Her hand was shaking so badly the dark liquid rippled in miniature waves. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a severe knot, her face pale as the snow outside. But her eyes were dry. She had moved past fear into that numb, cold place, where survival instinct takes over. Elias took the cup. "Where's the boy?" "Under the floorboards in the pantry. The root cellar trap door. I put the rug over it." "Good. If they breach the door, you go down there with him. You don't come out until you hear my voice. If you hear anyone else, you use the pistol I gave you." Sarah looked at the Colt Navy sitting on the windowsill. "I've never shot a man, Elias." "You aim for the belt buckle," Elias said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Recoil takes it up to the chest. Don't close your eyes." He looked out the window. The valley was a grey smear under the heavy clouds. The snow had stopped, but the ground was a treacherous mix of mud and ice. Visibility was poor, a haze of fog clinging to the hollows. "They're coming," Elias said. It wasn't a question. He didn't see them yet, but the birds had stopped singing in the tree line. The silence had teeth. Sarah stiffened. She looked out, squinting. "I don't see. Get to the pantry," Elias ordered, setting the cup down. "Now." She hesitated, her hand hovering over his shoulder as if she wanted to touch him, to thank him, or maybe just to anchor herself to something solid one last time. Then she turned and ran, her footsteps light on the wood. Elias jacked the lever of the Sharps. Clack, clack, then, out of the mist they emerged. There were 6 of them this time. They rode abreast, spreading out in a skirmish line as they crested the ridge. In the center, on a horse the color of spilled cream, sat a man who looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a bankers' meeting. He wore a long fur-collared coat, a silk cravat, and a hat that cost more than Elias's entire ranch. Josiah Sterling. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a ledger book with a pulse. They stopped 50 yards out, just beyond the effective range of a pistol, but well within the reach of the sharps. Sterling raised a gloved hand. The riders halted. "Mr. Thorne." Sterling's voice carried easily over the stillness. It was a cultivated baritone, smooth and arrogant. "I believe you have something that belongs to the company." Elias didn't answer. He cracked the window open just an inch, resting the barrel of the buffalo gun on the sill. He sighted down the long octagonal barrel, putting the brass bead right on Sterling's chest. "I have a deed to this land," Elias shouted back, "and you're standing on it." Sterling chuckled, a dry sound. "Land is dirt, Mr. Thorne. I'm talking about assets. Specifically, a woman and a male child bonded to the Copper Creek Mining Consortium. They are in breach of contract. Theft of company property. I am here to collect." "People ain't property," Elias growled to himself. Loudly, he yelled, "They ain't here. Moved on 2 days ago." "A lie," Sterling replied, his voice hardening. "We tracked the heat from your chimney. We know they are inside. Now I am a reasonable man. Send them out and we leave your hovel standing. Refuse, and we will burn it to the ground. The choice is economic, Mr. Thorne. Cut your losses." "I reckon the loss is going to be yours," Elias muttered. He didn't wait for a countdown. He didn't wait for them to draw. Elias squeezed the trigger. The sharps roared like a cannon. The recoil slammed into Elias's shoulder, a familiar, brutal kick. The heavy .50 caliber slug tore through the air and struck the rider to Sterling's left, a man raising a torch. The man was lifted out of his saddle as if yanked by an invisible wire, his chest exploding in a red mist. He hit the mud before the sound of the shot even finished echoing. Chaos erupted. "Kill him!" Sterling shrieked, his composure shattering. Instantly, as his horse reared in panic. "Kill him now!" The remaining 5 riders spurred their horses forward, guns blazing. Bullets hammered the side of the house, punching through the wood, shattering the window glass into 1,000 glittering shards. Elias threw himself to the floor, the glass raining down on his back. He rolled, abandoning the single-shot sharps, and grabbed the Winchester 1873 leaning against the wall. He crawled to the next window, popping up just long enough to fire. Bang, bang, bang. He worked the lever with a speed born of desperation. He hit a horse, sending it tumbling into the snow, its rider pinned beneath the thrashing beast. Another bullet took the hat off a man trying to flank the porch. "They're circling," Elias realized. "They're going to try the back." He scrambled across the floor, staying low as bullets chewed up the furniture above him. Splinters flew like shrapnel. A vase exploded. The air was thick with the smell of black powder and pulverized plaster. He reached the kitchen just as the back door shuddered under a heavy impact. Someone was ramming it. Elias fired through the door. Once, twice, 3 times, a scream from the other side. The ramming stopped, but he had forgotten the front. Glass shattered in the great room. A Molotov cocktail, a simple bottle of kerosene, with a burning rag, sailed through the broken window and smashed against the stone hearth. Flames whooshed up, catching the rug, licking at the curtains. "Smoke him out!" Sterling yelled from the yard. Elias coughed, the acrid smoke already stinging his eyes. He couldn't stay inside. If he stayed, they burned. If he went out, he died. "Sarah!" he roared toward the pantry. "Stay down!" He kicked the front door open and charged out onto the porch, the Winchester barking. He was a demon wreathed in smoke, firing from the hip. He caught one man rushing the steps, putting a round in his belly. The man folded, but there were 2. Many Sterling was there, sitting calmly on his horse amidst the carnage, a long-barreled Remington in his hand. He wasn't firing wildly, he was aiming. Elias saw the flash. It felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. The bullet took him high in the right shoulder, spinning him around. The Winchester flew from his numb fingers, clattering onto the porch boards. Elias slammed into the railing, his vision swimming, the world tilting sideways. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, his hand clutching the wound. Blood, hot and slick, poured between his fingers. "A valiant effort," Sterling said, riding closer. He looked down at Elias with a mixture of pity and disgust, but ultimately, bad business. Sterling dismounted. He walked up the steps, his boots thudding ominously. He kicked the Winchester away. He stood over Elias, cocking the hammer of his revolver. "Where are they?" Sterling demanded. Elias looked up. His face was grey, sweat streaking the soot. He spat blood onto Sterling's polished boot. "Go to hell." "I'll find them," Sterling said, "and I'll make the boy watch what happens to you." He raised the gun to Elias's forehead. Elias closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He just thought of Clara. "I tried, Clara. I tried." Suddenly, the front door creaked. Sterling turned. Toby stood there. The boy. He had crawled out of the pantry. He wasn't hiding. He was standing in the open doorway, holding the small wooden horse Elias had carved. He looked at Sterling, his eyes wide, mute, trembling. "Ah," Sterling smiled, turning his gun away from Elias and pointing it at the child. "The asset." "No!" Elias screamed. He lunged. With his last reserve of strength, Elias threw himself forward, not at Sterling, but across the space between the gunman and the boy. Bang! The shot rang out. But Elias didn't feel it. Sterling stiffened. A look of profound confusion crossed his face. He looked down at his own chest. A red flower was blooming there, rapidly expanding on his white shirt. He staggered back, dropping his gun. He looked toward the ridgeline, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Elias turned his head, his vision blurring. On the ridge, silhouetted against the grey sky, sat a solitary rider. He held a long rifle, smoke curling lazily from the barrel. Sterling fell backward over the porch railing, crashing into the mud below. He twitched once, and then lay still. The remaining hired guns froze. They looked at their dead paymaster. They looked at the ridge. Then, without a word, they holstered their weapons, turned their horses, and bolted. They weren't paid enough to fight U.S. Marshals. Elias slumped against the wall, the adrenaline fading, the pain rushing in like a tidal wave. He looked at Toby. The boy was unharmed. He was staring at Elias, tears tracking through the soot on his face. The rider on the ridge slowly descended. As he rode into the yard, the tin star on his chest caught the glorious, fleeting light of the sun breaking through the clouds. It was Marshal Silas Graves, the man who had been hunting Sterling across 3 territories for fraud and murder. Graves dismounted, walking slowly up the steps. He looked at the dead body of Sterling, then at Elias. He tipped his hat. "You look like hell, Thorne," the marshal rumbled. "You're late," Elias wheezed, clutching his shoulder. "Roads were bad," Graves replied dryly. Sarah burst through the door. Then, screaming Elias's name, she fell to her knees beside him, her hands pressing onto his wound, trying to staunch the flow. "I've got you," she sobbed. "I've got you." Elias looked at her, then at Toby, who had crept closer and was now holding Elias's uninjured hand with a grip that threatened to break his fingers. He was trespassing," Elias whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. Then the darkness took him, but this time it wasn't the cold darkness of the grave. It was just rest. Pain was a landscape, and Elias Thorne had mapped every inch of it. The first thing he knew was the smell, not the metallic tang of blood or the acrid bite of black powder that had filled his nose when he fell, but something sharper, cleaner. Iodine, strong spirits, and beneath that, the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender. He drifted in a fever dream for what felt like a week, floating on a raft of agony that throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He saw Clara again, but this time she wasn't calling him into the cold. She was standing at the foot of a bed, smiling, and then she turned into Sarah, her face lined with worry, holding a wet rag to his forehead. When he finally opened his eyes, for good, the storm was over. Sunlight, painfully bright and unfiltered by the grime that had once coated the windows, slashed across the quilt. He was in his own bed. He hadn't slept in this room since the day Clara died. He tried to move, and a bolt of lightning shot from his right shoulder down to his fingertips, tearing a gasp from his dry throat. "Easy," a voice murmured. Sarah was there. She was sitting in the cane-bottom chair, a piece of sewing in her lap. She looked different. The hunted, feral look was gone, replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. She put the sewing down, one of his old flannel shirts she was mending, and leaned forward. "The bullet went through," she said softly, her hand hovering over his arm but not touching it, as if she were afraid he might break. "Clean through the meat. Missed the bone by a fraction of an inch. Marshal Graves said you have the luck of a fool." "Graves?" Elias rasped. His voice sounded like he'd swallowed a handful of gravel. "He's gone. Took the bodies, took the horses. Said he'd be back when the snow clears to finish the paperwork." Elias tried to sit up again, gritting his teeth against the vertigo. "The boy? Toby," she corrected him gently. "His name is Toby. Where is he?" "Outside, with Barnaby. He's brushing him. He's been brushing that horse for 3 days straight. I think he believes if he stops, the bad men will come back." Elias fell back against the pillows, the adrenaline of the fight finally draining away, leaving him hollow. He looked at the ceiling, tracing the water stains in the plaster. "They ain't coming back," he whispered. "Sterling? Dead," Sarah said. She didn't sound happy about it, just factual. "Graves said he was wanted in 3 states. Said the copper company he worked for disowned him the minute the shooting started. They claimed he was a rogue agent. It's over, Elias. It took a month for the shoulder to heal enough for him to hold a hammer, and another month before he could swing it without seeing stars. In that time, the winter finally broke. The thaw was violent, the creek swelling to a torrent, the snow retreating to reveal the black, rich earth of the valley floor, and with the spring came the silence. Not the terrifying silence of the blizzard, but the peaceful silence of a home that was breathing again. Elias watched them from the porch. He sat in his rocker, a blanket over his legs, watching Sarah turn the soil in the small garden plot she had reclaimed from the weeds. She was fierce in her work, attacking the ground with the same determination she had used to keep her son alive. And Toby. Toby was a shadow no longer. He was everywhere. He was carrying water buckets that were too heavy for him, his face scrunching with effort, refusing help. He was following Elias around the smithy, handing him tools before Elias even asked for them. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. They were 3 broken people who had found jagged pieces that fit together. Then came the day the marshal returned. It was late April. The valley was a riot of green, the wildflowers exploding in purple and yellow bursts across the pasture. Marshal. Graves rode up the lane in a buckboard, accompanied by a man in a black suit who looked like he was afraid of getting mud on his boots. A circuit judge. Elias met them at the gate. He was walking without the cane now, though the limp was more pronounced. He wore a clean shirt, pressed by Sarah, and he had shaved his beard down to a manageable trim. "Thorne," Graves nodded, stepping down. "Brought you something." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick envelope. Sterling's estate was liquidated. The court ruled that his seizure of your livestock and his attempted seizure of these people was unlawful. There's a settlement. It ain't a fortune, but it'll fix that roof and buy you a herd. Elias took the envelope. He didn't open it. "I don't want his money." "Take it," Graves said sharply. "Call it back wages for the bullet in your shoulder." "These hay." Judge cleared his throat. He was holding a ledger. "Mr. Thorne, there is also the matter of the dependents, the woman, Sarah Miller, and the minor child, Tobias. Legally speaking, they are wards of the territory now that their indenture contract has been voided. Unless they have a guardian or a means of support, I am obliged to transport them to the mission in Helena." Elias felt the cold creeping back. Ititi. He looked at the porch. Sarah was standing there, wiping her hands on her apron. Toby was clinging to her skirts, his eyes wide, watching the strangers. The mission. He knew that place. It was a warehouse for unwanted souls, cold, loveless, a place where children learn to be invisible. Elias looked at the judge. "They ain't going to Helena, sir, without a legal standing." "I'm marrying her," Elias said. The words hung in the air, heavy as anvil strikes. He hadn't planned to say it. He hadn't even asked her. It just came out, a defensive reflex, a shield thrown up to protect the only things that mattered. He turned to look at Sarah. She hadn't moved. Her face was unreadable. Elias walked up the steps, his boots heavy on the wood. He stopped in front of her. He took his hat off, twisting the brim in his scarred hands. He felt like a boy again, terrified and clumsy. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I ain't a man of fancy words. You know that. I'm broken in places that don't mend. I got ghosts in this house that might never leave. But I got a good piece of land. I got strong hands, and I promise you, you'll never be cold again. You'll never be hungry. And he pointed to Toby. He'll never be afraid, not while I'm breathing." Sarah looked at him. She looked at the scars. On his face, the grey in his hair, the gun belt he had hung up but kept oiled. She saw the man who had walked through a blizzard to save them. She saw the father he had been, and the father he could be. "Is that a proposal, Elias Thorne?" She asked, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "It's a promise," Elias said. "If you'll have me." She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was strong. "I'll have you." The judge married them right there on the porch, with the marshal as a witness and the wind as the choir. It wasn't a romance. It was a covenant. When it was done, the judge looked at Toby. "And the boy? The papers need to be specific. Does he retain the name Miller?" Elias looked down at the boy. Toby was looking up at him, the same intensity in his eyes as that night, in the shack. "Toby," Elias said, crouching down so they were eye to eye. His knee popped, but he ignored it. "It's up to you. You can keep your name. It's a good name. Or you can take mine. If you take mine, it means you're my son. It means this land is yours one day. It means we're kin." Toby looked at the judge. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at Elias. He reached out and touched the scar on Elias's shoulder, the puckered flesh where the bullet had gone in. He opened his mouth. His throat worked, the muscles straining against the silence of 3 years. "Thorne," Toby whispered. It was a rusty, creaking sound, like a gate opening after a long winter. Toby Thorne. Elias closed his eyes, fighting back the sting of tears he refused to shed in front of the marshal. He pulled the boy into his chest, burying his face in the child's hair. "Toby Thorne," he repeated. "Sounds about right." Epilogue. 20 years later. The Double T was no longer just a house, it was a landmark. The herd numbered in the thousands. Now, the cattle sleek and fat on the rich valley grass. The house had been expanded, a new wing added on the west side, painted a crisp, clean white that gleamed in the Montana sun. On the porch, in the same spot where he had once held a sharps rifle and waited for death. An old man sat in a rocking chair. Elias Thorne was ancient now. His hair was snow-white, his face a roadmap of deep canyons and ridges carved by time and weather. His bad leg was stiff as a board, and he needed a cane just to get to the privy, but his eyes were still sharp. They were watching the corral. Young man was in the ring, working a colt. He moved with a fluid, easy grace, his hat pulled low, his hands gentle on the reins. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that calmed the skittish animal. "He's got your hands," a voice said. Elias turned. Sarah was sitting beside him. Her hair was grey, pulled back in a soft bun, but her back was straight. She was shelling peas into a bowl, the rhythmic pop-snap a comforting percussion. "He's got your stubbornness," Elias grunted, though his eyes crinkled with pride. "Told him that colt was too green to ride today. Didn't listen." "He never listens," Sarah smiled. "Just like his father." Elias looked back at the corral. Tobias. Thorn, the finest horseman in the territory, swung up into the saddle. The colt bucked once, twice, but Toby rode it out, laughing, patting the animal's neck until it settled. Elias looked at the mantle through the open window. The wooden horse was still there. It was polished smooth now, worn down by years of handling, first by Toby, and now by Toby's own daughter, who was currently asleep in the nursery upstairs. Next to the wooden horse was a framed photograph. Elias, Sarah and Toby standing in front of the ranch on that first spring day. He thought about the blizzard. He thought about the bone-cracking cold, the despair, the bottle of whiskey that had been his only friend. He thought about how close he had come to dying alone in the snow, a bitter, hollow shell of a man. He looked at Sarah, his wife of 20 years. He looked at Toby, his son. He looked at the valley, alive and vibrant. The ghosts were gone. Clara was at peace. Samuel was at peace. And Elias. Elias was home. He reached out and covered Sarah's hand with his own. The skin was paper thin, but the warmth was still there. "What are you thinking about, old man?" she asked. Elias watched his son ride the colt toward the gate, the future opening up before them like the vast, endless sky. "I was thinking," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that merged with the wind in the pines, "that folks always say blood is thicker than water, but they're wrong. Blood is just an accident of birth. Love is the work you put in when the storm comes." He squeezed her hand, closing his eyes as the sun warmed his face. "Family is chosen, not born."